In the Middle Ages, the concept of work was not exactly as we understand it today. There were no air-conditioned offices, coffee breaks, or endless Zoom meetings. In contrast, working life was marked by sweat, dirt, and in many cases, a level of misery that would make any modern employee resign instantly. If you think your boss is demanding or that cleaning the office microwave is an unpleasant task, wait until you learn about some of the worst jobs in medieval history. These jobs were so arduous that, in comparison, collecting garbage in a modern city would seem like a walk in the countryside. Today we will delve into the fascinating and often disgusting world of medieval work, with a special focus on those jobs that made people dream of anything but getting up in the morning. Prepare yourself for a trip filled with foul smells, absurd tasks, and a good dose of humor to lighten the mood, because believe me, you're going to need it. Imagine for a moment that you are a peasant in 11th century Europe. Your life is dictated by the feudal lord, the climate, and a life expectancy that barely exceeds 35 years, and that's if you're lucky. Most people worked the land, but not everyone could be a farmer or a blacksmith. Some, unfortunately, ended up in occupations that were a mixture of divine punishment and a cruel joke of fate. One of the worst jobs of the time, without a doubt, was that of a latrine cleaner. Yes, you read that right. Someone had to be in charge of emptying the latrine pits, those mass graves where human waste accumulated in industrial quantities. There were no modern sewage systems, so castles, monasteries, and cities relied on these brave or unfortunate individuals to keep things minimally hygienic. The latrine cleaner, known in England as a Gong Farmer, a man whose name sounds like an insult but was literal, worked at night when the rest of the world was asleep to avoid stares and comments. Armed with a shovel, a bucket, and an iron will, this poor man would dive into a pit of excrement, literally to scoop out the contents and transport them out of the city, often in wheelbarrows that left an unmistakable trail. The smell, as you can imagine, was unbearable. There were no masks or nitrile gloves in the Middle Ages. At best, the latrine cleaner could wrap his face in a rag, but that did little against the stench that permeated his skin, his clothes, and probably his soul. Furthermore, the work was dangerous. The gases that accumulated in the pits could be toxic, and it was not uncommon for these workers to faint or even die from asphyxiation. To make matters worse, the salary was miserable, and society looked down on them. Nobody wanted to sit near a Gong Farmer in the tavern, no matter how many times he washed, but what alternative did they have? In a world where social mobility was virtually non-existent, many accepted this job because it was better than starving to death. Although honestly, after a day shoveling garbage, death by starvation might have seemed like a tempting option. Another job that deserves a place in the pantheon of hellish jobs is that of leather tanner. Leather was essential in the Middle Ages. It was used for armor, shoes, belts, saddles, and more. But the process of turning an animal's skin into usable leather was an olfactory and physical nightmare. First, the tanner had to collect the fresh hides, which often arrived with remnants of meat, fat, and hair. These hides were then soaked in a mixture of water, urine, and lime to soften them and remove the hair. Yes, urine. Tanners often relied on urine collected from local taverns or even their own families, making this work a rather unpleasant form of medieval recycling. Once the hide was clean, it was soaked in an even more disgusting broth, a mixture of dog or pigeon droppings that helped to soften the leather. The tanner spent hours stirring these hides in large vats, his hands submerged in liquids that would make anyone vomit. The smell of a tannery was so intense that these facilities were usually located on the outskirts of cities, far from the sensitive noses of the nobles. But for the tanner, there was no escape. He lived surrounded by that stench, and his hands, constantly damp and exposed to corrosive chemicals, cracked and became covered in sores. In addition, the work was exhausting. Removing heavy hides, scraping them with knives, and stretching them required considerable physical strength. And as in the case of the latrine cleaner, the pay was low and the social stigma high. Nobody wanted to be friends with the guy who smelled like dog excrement and rancid urine. However, tanners were essential to the medieval economy, which shows that even the most disgusting jobs had a place in society. If you think those jobs were bad, wait until you hear about the Leech Collector. In the Middle Ages, medicine was not exactly an exact science. Doctors believed that many diseases were due to an imbalance of the body. Tumors, and a common way to treat this was through bloodletting. This is where the leeches came in, tiny aquatic vampires that attached themselves to the skin and sucked blood. But someone had to get those leeches, and that someone wasn't exactly the doctor who charged a fortune for his services. The Leech Collector walked barefoot through swamps and pools, letting these creatures attach themselves to his legs. Once he had enough, he would carefully pluck them out and store them in jars to sell to doctors or apothecaries. This job was not only uncomfortable, but also risky. Medieval marshes were not exactly well-maintained nature parks. They were full of mud, insects, and in some cases, larger animals that wouldn't hesitate to bite. Infections were common, as leeches are not known for their hygiene, and open wounds in a swamp could become a serious problem. In addition, the Leech Collector had to be patient because he didn't always find enough in a single day. Imagine spending hours with your feet in murky water, waiting for a slimy worm to decide to pay you a visit. And all this for a handful of coins that were barely enough to buy bread. If you have ever felt that your job is monotonous, think of the poor Leech Collector counting his catches while trying not to faint from blood loss. And remember, if you want to learn more about the topic, I've included a link in the description to a book that goes into more detail. Because believe me, there is much more to tell about these forgotten professions. That made the medieval world work, even if it was through suffering. Another contender for the title of worst medieval job is that of wool treader. This job, common in regions where cloth production was a key industry, consisted of getting into large vats full of raw wool and treading on it for hours to clean and compact it. But it wasn't as simple as it sounds. The raw wool was full of dirt, grease, and often remnants of sheep excrement. To clean it, the stonecutters worked in a mixture of warm water and urine that acted as a natural detergent. Yes, urine again. It seems that in the Middle Ages this liquid was the star ingredient for any unpleasant task. The treaders spent all day inside these vats with their feet submerged in a foul-smelling broth, treading and treading until the wool was ready for the next step in the process. The work was physically exhausting, as it required maintaining a constant pace for hours. In addition, the constant humidity caused skin infections, and the smell, as you can imagine, was not exactly like roses. Wool handlers were also exposed to disease, as raw wool could contain parasites or bacteria. And as in many of these jobs, the pay was low and the recognition non-existent. However, wool production was one of the most important industries of the time, especially in places like England and Flanders. So these workers were essential, even though nobody wanted to invite them to dinner. Now let's talk about a job that, although not as physically disgusting, had its own share of misery: the whipping man. In the Middle Ages, corporal punishment was common, and someone had to administer the whippings to criminals, heretics, or anyone who had angered the local lord. This job might have sounded exciting to someone with sadistic tendencies, but in reality it was psychologically exhausting. The whipping man had to inflict pain precisely, strong enough to fulfill the sentence, but not so strong as to kill the condemned man, at least not always. This required a certain level of skill, but also an emotional detachment. Imagine having to whip a neighbor, or worse, someone who hadn't committed a serious crime, just because the feudal lord was in a bad mood. The whipping man was often seen as a social outcast. Nobody wanted to be friends with the guy who could whip you in the town square. Furthermore, the work was not without risks. If the condemned person was popular or had influential friends, the flogger could become the target of the community's anger. And of course, the salary did not compensate for the emotional stress or social isolation. In a world where violence was commonplace, this job remained one of the least desirable. If you're enjoying this journey through the worst jobs in history, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more historical content with a touch of humor. Because even though these jobs are from the past, the lessons they teach us are timeless. Let's talk now about the salt collectors. Salt was a highly valuable resource in the Middle Ages, known as white gold because it was essential for preserving food, but extracting it was no picnic. The salt harvesters worked in Salinas, where seawater evaporated in large pools under the scorching sun. This work was exhausting, as it involved moving large quantities of salt, water, raking the crystallized salt, and transporting it in heavy sacks. Constant contact with salt irritated the skin and eyes, and long hours in the sun could cause dehydration or sunstroke. In winter, the cold added another layer of suffering, as the salt water felt like needles on the skin. Furthermore, Salvanudo harvesters worked in conditions of semi-slavery, especially in regions where feudal lords controlled the salt flats. The wages were low, and the workers were exposed to accidents such as falls into the pools or injuries from the weight of the sacks. However, salt was so valuable that these workers were essential to the economy. Without them, food could not be preserved, and winter would be a death sentence for many communities. So, although the work was miserable, the salt collectors could at least console themselves by thinking that they were indispensable, or at least try to be. Another job we cannot overlook is that of rat catcher. Medieval cities were plagued by rodents that not only ate stored crops, but also spread diseases like the plague. The rat catcher was a kind of unsung hero, but his job was far from glamorous. Armed with traps, homemade poisons, and sometimes just his bare hands, this individual roamed dark alleyways and infested warehouses, facing off against rats that were not exactly cartoonish little mice. Some of these rats were large, aggressive, and could bite. In addition, the rat catcher was constantly exposed to disease as he handled dead animals and worked in dirty places. The poison they used, often arsenic-based, was as dangerous to the hunter as it was to the rats. A miscalculation could mean poisoning oneself or others, and as expected, the salary was low and the social stigma was high. High. Nobody wanted to be seen with the rat man, even though everyone depended on him to keep the barns free of pests. In an ironic twist, these workers were often accused of witchcraft, and things went wrong because, of course, who else would be so comfortable, surrounded by animals associated with the devil? And remember, if you want to learn more about the topic, I've included a link in the description to a book that goes into more detail. Medieval history is full of fascinating details, and this book is a goldmine for the curious. Let's move on to another job that, although less well-known, was no less unpleasant: the charcoal burner. Making charcoal was crucial in the Middle Ages, as it was used to heat homes, cook, and fuel blacksmiths' forges. But the process was slow, dirty, and dangerous. The charcoal burner lived in the forest, far from civilization, where he spent weeks watching over piles of wood that burned slowly under a layer of earth to produce charcoal. This process, known as carbonization, required constant attention. If the fire went out, the coal was useless. If it burned too much, everything turned to ashes. The charcoal burner lived in makeshift huts, surrounded by smoke and soot, breathing toxic air that damaged his lungs over time. Isolation was another problem. Charcoal burners could go months without seeing their families, and their work was so specialized that they couldn't simply leave it unfinished. Furthermore, the risk of forest fires was constant, and one mistake could cost them their lives or destroy their livelihood. The wage, as always, was low, and the charcoal burner returned home covered in soot, with his clothes and skin permanently stained black. Despite its importance, this job was seen as one of the lowest in the social hierarchy, which added an extra layer of humiliation. If all these jobs seem bad to you, wait until you meet the undertaker. In an era where epidemics, wars, and poor hygiene made death a constant companion, someone had to take care of the bodies. Gravediggers dug mass graves, especially during outbreaks of plague, and handled decomposing corpses without any protection. The risk of infection was extremely high, and the smell, as you can imagine, was unbearable. In addition, the grave diggers often worked under pressure, as the bodies had to be buried quickly to prevent the spread of disease. In many cities, this work was considered so dangerous that criminals were forced to do it as part of their punishment. The undertaker also had to deal with the emotional weight of his job. Imagine spending your days surrounded by death, digging graves for neighbors, friends, or even family members. In times of plague, gravediggers could be the only survivors in a community, making them feared and avoided figures. Nobody wanted to get close to someone who smelled like death, and who, according to the beliefs of the time, could be cursed. Despite their importance, gravediggers were marginalized and poorly paid, making them another perfect example of the forgotten heroes of the Middle Ages. If you've been fascinated by this glimpse into the darker side of medieval history, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content that blends humor and knowledge, because history isn't always pretty, but it's always interesting. Now, let's delve a little deeper into these works, because each one has details that make medieval life seem even more surreal. Let's take the case of the latrine cleaner. Not only did they face the smell and toxic fumes, but they also had to deal with local laws. In some cities, such as London, the Gong Farmers could only work at night and had to take the waste to specific locations outside the city, often several kilometers away. This meant carrying heavy buckets or wheelbarrows across muddy roads in the dark, risking attack by bandits or wild animals. Furthermore, the latrines in castles were not exactly accessible. Sometimes the cleaner had to climb narrow ladders, or even descend into deep pits using ropes, all while trying not to spill the contents of his bucket on himself. A bad day at this job wasn't just unpleasant, it was a logistical nightmare. The tanners, for their part, not only worked with urine and excrement, they also had to face the whims of the weather. If it rained too much, the hides could rot before the process was completed. If it was too hot, the liquid in the vats would evaporate, leaving the hides dry and cracked. Furthermore, tanners often worked in teams, which meant that the smell wasn't just yours, but that of everyone around you. Imagine a tannery full of sweating workers, stirring vats and shouting instructions to each other while the stench filled the air. It was like a symphony of misery, with a smell that could probably be smelled miles away. The Leech Collector also had his own unique challenges. Not only did he have to walk through swamps, but he often did so in regions where the water was polluted by human or animal waste. This increased the risk of infections, and it was not uncommon for a picker to end up with fevers or wounds that would not heal. Furthermore, the eels were not easy to handle. Some were larger than you could imagine, and peeling them off the skin without damaging them, or without bleeding out, required a skill that could only be gained through years of practice. The doctors, of course, didn't pay much for the eels, so the collector had to catch large quantities to earn a living. It was a slow, painful, and frankly, somewhat humiliating job. The wool treaders, meanwhile, not only had to deal with the smell of urine and raw wool, they also had to endure boredom. Stomping on wool for hours was not exactly a stimulating mental exercise. To pass the time, many sang or told stories, which gave rise to some popular songs of the time. But even with the music, the work was monotonous and physically exhausting. The vats were large and the wool was heavy. So, the stone walkers ended the day with pain in their legs and back. In addition, constant contact with urine caused skin irritations, and it was not uncommon for workers to develop chronic foot infections. The whipping man, although he did not work in such a dirty environment, had to deal with social pressure. In many communities, this work was seen as a kind of betrayal. Whipping a neighbor could make you public enemy number one, and it was not uncommon for whippers to be attacked or intimidated. Furthermore, the job required surgical precision. A poorly delivered lash could cause serious injury or even death, which could get the whipper into trouble with the authorities. And in a cruel twist, sometimes the whipper himself could be punished if he did not meet the feudal lord's expectations. It was a job where you couldn't win, no matter how well you did. The salt harvesters, for their part, faced a hostile environment that combined the heat of the sun, the cold of winter, and the constant irritation of the salt. Salt works were often located in remote areas, which meant that workers lived away from their families for long periods. Furthermore, salt was such a valuable resource that feudal lords kept a close eye on the workers, making sure they didn't steal even a handful. This created an atmosphere of constant mistrust, where the harvesters were treated more like prisoners than employees. And of course, the physical work was brutal. Moving sacks of salt from one place to another under the sun or in the rain left the workers exhausted and with chronic pain. The rat catcher, although essential, also had to contend with the superstitions of the time. In a world where the plague was seen as divine punishment, rodents were often associated with evil. This meant that the rat catcher, by working with these animals, could be seen as someone who had dealings with dark forces. In some cases, these workers were accused of witchcraft or of deliberately spreading the plague, which put them at risk of being lynched or executed. And to make matters worse, the poison they used wasn't always effective, which meant that sometimes they had to face live, aggressive rats with their bare hands. The charcoal burner, isolated in the forest, also had to deal with loneliness. Spending weeks or months alone, surrounded by smoke and fire, was not exactly a recipe for happiness. Furthermore, the carbonization process was incredibly delicate. A mistake in the amount of oxygen entering the woodpile could ruin the entire batch, leaving the charcoal maker with nothing to sell. And because coal was heavy and difficult to transport, coal merchants often had to carry large quantities along rough roads to the nearest market. It was a job that combined isolation, danger, and physical exertion into a particularly depressing mix. Finally, the undertaker not only dealt with death, but also with fear. In times of plague, gravediggers were seen as bringers of bad luck, and many avoided even looking them in the eye. In addition, the work was physically exhausting. Digging mass graves required hours of effort, often in the rain or on hard ground. And in many cases the gravediggers had to work quickly, since the decomposing bodies could begin to spread disease if they were not buried in time. It was a job that combined physical exhaustion with emotional trauma, all for a salary that barely covered survival. These jobs, although essential to medieval society, were a constant reminder of how hard life could be in that era. Each of them came with their own mix of misery, danger, and social stigma, but also with a strange dignity, because despite everything, these workers kept the world going. Without them, cities would have drowned in waste, the economy would have ground to a halt, and society as they knew it would have collapsed. So the next time you complain about a poorly written email or an unnecessary meeting, think of the latrine cleaner, the tanner, the leech collector, or the undertaker. They certainly knew what a bad day at work was like. Oh, music,